Science now is under assault, and you're one of the visionary scientists who's critiqued modern science, modern materialism. And I wonder on what are some of the bases on which you think it's faulty and lacking?
Well, I think modern materialism is faulty on several bases. I mean, most of all, the fact it's just a very limited philosophy of nature. It says the whole universe is made of matter or physical reality, which is non-conscious. Evolution has occurred with no purpose whatsoever. The evolution of life as its main creative force is just chance. That minds are nothing but the activity of brains, and that consciousness doesn't actually do anything. We don't have free will. Consciousness doesn't really influence the brain. It's just a kind of meaningless byproduct of brain activity.
And it's illusionary. It's really doesn't exist in I.
It doesn't do anything. It's itself, the sense of self is an illusion. So, I mean, it's a very deeply depressing worldview, and I think that people who believe it tend to become depressed. I think that's why depression is an endemic condition in most modern secular societies.
It's a lack of purpose and meaning.
A lack of purpose and meaning. So this worldview, I mean, many materialists admit that it's depressing, but they think that because they think they're committed to truth, that you have to have a kind of heroic acceptance of this, even if it's deeply depressing, because it's true. The trouble is, it's not true. It's simply an assumption. It's a belief system. And most people who believe it don't realize it's a belief system. As I show in my book, Science Set Free, it's based on 10 assumptions, every one of which turns out to be false, or at least too limited, in the light of scientific advances itself. The assumptions, I won't go through them all, but the idea that matter's unconscious, that the mind's nothing but the brain, the universe has no purpose, that the laws of nature are fixed, the total amount of matter and energy is always the same. These are some of the assumptions. Mechanistic medicine is the only kind that really works. That follows from these other assumptions. Nature is mechanical or machine-like. These are simply assumptions. Once they first got built into science, they were sort of simplifying working assumptions, but they've now hardened into dogmas as part of a belief system. And I think that they're actually restricting scientific research, constricting what people can think about, preventing research that goes beyond these dogmas. And they're actually holding science back, which is why my book on the subject is called Science Set Free. In Britain it's called The Science Delusion. And the science delusion is the belief that science already understands the nature of reality in principle, leaving only the details to be filled in. And I think that's profoundly false. I think we understand very little about the nature of reality.
You were influenced by Kuhn's book about paradigm change, as was Marilyn Schlitz, and I wonder if you were going to define a new paradigm of science. I know that's a big question, but how would you redefine it?
Well, I think the outlines of a new paradigm are fairly clear. Instead of using a machine as the primary metaphor for nature, then we use the organism. Instead of thinking of living organisms as machines, we think of them as living organisms. That's basically fairly simple. Instead of thinking of Gaia, the planet, as a misty ball of rock hurtling around the sun in accordance with mathematical laws, we think of Gaia as a living organism. In fact, we think of the whole universe as like an organism. A galaxy is like an organism. A solar system is like an organism. So instead of the machine metaphor, we have an organism metaphor. Instead of the attempt to reduce everything to the smallest possible particles of which it's made, atoms or subatomic particles, and explain everything from the bottom up in terms of its smallest constituents, we recognize that nature is made up of many levels. Each level is a whole that's more than the sum of the parts. So an organism like me isn't a whole that's made up of parts which are organs, eyes, livers, spleen, kidney, etc. These organs are parts that are made up of wholes that are made up of parts that are cells, tissues, and then tissues made up of cells, cells of organelles, and so on. And individual organisms like me are part of larger social organism, families, groups of every kind. We're within the ecosystem, we're within the planet Earth, that's within the solar system, within the galaxy. So at every level, there's a wholeness that's more than the sum of the parts. And a third aspect of this paradigm is that it's evolutionary. Everything has evolved, starting with the Big Bang. So all of physics is evolutionary, all of chemistry is evolutionary. There were once no nickel atoms and no iron atoms. Those two have evolved. Molecules and crystals haven't always been there. They have a history as well.
We're by an airport in Santa Clara.
Another aspect of this paradigm, this is my own particular contribution, or the part that I'm most keen on, is the idea there's a memory in nature, that the universe is evolving, and the so-called laws of nature are more like habits. They're not fixed laws that were all there at the minute of the Big Bang. So there's a development in nature, and it's one with memory, habit, and that memories in general, each species has collective memories, and even individual memories are not stored inside brains. They're produced by a process of resonance, what I call morphic resonance. So that's another aspect of this paradigm. And a crucial part of all this is that mind or consciousness is not something that just appears inside human brains, but rather that there's a kind of mentality or experience, even in atoms and molecules, in stars, in galaxies, in animals and plants. The kind of mind or purposive organizing principle is different according to each species, but all these kinds of systems have a kind of internal purpose, which is usually their own survival. In the case of biological organisms, their reproduction. And that these mind-like organizing principles draw the system towards future goals or attractors. They're not just pushed from the past by blind forces. So consciousness is not something that appears simply and only in human brains, but is something that pervades the whole universe.
And is primary, fundamental?
Consciousness is fundamental in the sense that it's there from the beginning. It's not as if there's no consciousness. I'm not an idealist, where idealists believe that consciousness is the only reality, that matter is kind of dumbed down mind. But I think that consciousness is part of the whole natural order, that there are forms of consciousness beyond the human level, that spiritual traditions are about connecting with these forms of more than human consciousness. And when we see things in that light, then the conflicts between science and religion become much less. In a mechanistic, materialist worldview, there is no God, there is no consciousness, there are no spirits, there's nothing but an illusion of consciousness inside human brains. And that, of course, is in great conflict with all religious and spiritual traditions throughout the world, whether they're shamanic or Buddhist or Hindu or Christian or Jewish or whatever, Muslim. They're all in conflict with mechanistic materialism, which is intrinsically atheistic.
How are these morphogenic fields that you've developed different from Jung's collective unconscious or the Hindu Akashic field, or what if there's an anatomy of the morphogenic field, what is it?
Morphogenetic, not genic, morphogenetic fields are fields concerned with the coming into being of form. And they're part of a general category of what I call morphic fields, which are to do with shape, form, structure, order, pattern. Each whole in a holistic system has its own kind of morphic field. A galaxy has a morphic field. A star has a morphic field. A planet, an animal, a microbe, they all have morphic fields.
Is it like an aura?
They're within and around the systems they organize. So you could say they're like auras in the sense that an aura extends beyond the system that it's connected with. But I don't call them auras, partly because I don't see auras myself. And even people who do see auras, different people don't agree in what they see. I think they're responding to something that's there. But I think the word field is much less mysterious. I mean, everyone agrees that magnetic fields surround magnets, the Earth's gravitational field surrounds the Earth. It's invisible, but it's there, and it has effects. I mean, if there wasn't a gravitational field, we'd be floating around right now. We're, in fact, held down towards the Earth by the Earth's gravitational field, which we can't see, but it surrounds the Earth.
It's a good analogy.
The point I'm making about these fields is that makes them different from Jung's collective unconscious is that his idea is of a collective human memory. But I'm saying this is just a tiny bit of a much, much bigger picture. Every species has a collective memory. Every kind of thing, each kind of crystal, each kind of molecule, each kind of planet, each kind of galaxy has a kind of collective memory. So it's much more general than Jung's theory of the collective unconscious. But Jung's theory fits very well with this worldview.
The implication to me of a morphogenetic, thank you, field is that that there's progress, that we learn, there's a stored memory. But it seems like human history is a history of wars and technology that is more destructive than ever, and these increasing numbers of autocrats. So is it not true that it's somehow progressive?
Morphogenetic fields, or I prefer the more general term morphic field. Morphogenesis is just about the development of form, and morphic includes behavior, mental activity, and so on. They're habits. There's nothing that guarantees progress in this. If there's a habit of war, then the more often it happens, the more it becomes a habit. There's no built-in moral progress in morphic resonance. We can try and build in a moral progress to human behavior, but it's not built into the system. It's a theory of habit in nature, that repetitive patterns become more habitual the more often they're repeated.
It happens in our brain patterns.
Our brain patterns are patterns of activity, and those become increasingly habitual through repetition. So there may well be a progressive principle in the history of the universe, but if there is, it's not one that avoids conflict.
Here comes a plane. Or is it Superman?
I mean, the history of the universe includes cataclysmic events like supernovas, exploding stars, and in fact, unless stars exploded, there would be no heavier chemical elements. You and I would not be here without exploding stars.
We're stardust.
And we're stardust. And we're only stardust because the stars explode. And if one thinks that progressive development is all a matter of just greater and greater harmony, etc., then it would be hard to explain supernovas. The history of life on Earth is one that includes a series of mass extinctions. The extinction of the dinosaurs was a disaster for dinosaurs, but it opened the way for mammals to evolve, and we're here because there was an extinction of the dinosaurs. So there are the history of life on Earth and the history of the universe is one that has destructive as well as creative events. And most models of creativity have to acknowledge the power of destruction as well as the power of creation.
And Hinduism recognizes that.
Well, all religions recognize it. You know, the God of the Old Testament is not uniformly a God of love. I mean, the liberation of the Jewish people from bondage in Egypt occurs as a result of 10 curses or plagues that fall on the people of Egypt. So it's not all light and love. There are massively destructive events in the Bible, including terrible wars. The 99 names of God in Islam include God as a creator, but also God as a destroyer. God as one who lifts up and one who can't, and God the abaser who casts down. So in Hinduism, Shiva is both a creator and a destroyer. So I think all religions recognize that there's these two sides.
Just like we need birth and death.
Just like we need birth and death, yes.
My last question is, I'm interested in the biographies, the influences that allowed people like you to take on the establishment. So you have a PhD in biochemistry, you're a cancer, you were raised in a family that wasn't very religious, I understand. What would you identify as what gave you the courage to take on the establishment?
Well, actually, I was raised in a family that was fairly religious. My parents were Methodists, and I think that did have some part in it, because the Methodist tradition is one of a community of people who are prepared to take on the established religion. I mean, in England, Methodists, Baptists, Congregationalists, and so on are called non-conformists because they wouldn't conform to the
Church of England.
The Church of England. So there's a whole tradition, and the labour movement in the 19th century was largely led by Methodists. In continental Europe, the socialist movement was primarily atheist, but in England it was not. It was a form of Christian socialism.